The barn was still standing. That was the first strange thing. Every other structure in the valley had been swallowed. Rooftops caved in, door frames split wide open, walls pushed inward by the weight of 3 feet of compacted snow. Entire homesteads gone, buried like they had never been there at all. But the barn stood. No smoke from a chimney. No footprints in the snow around it. No sign of life. Just 4 old walls of gray timber, standing quiet and upright in the middle of a valley that had essentially ceased to exist. The neighbors who survived that winter, those who made it through by burning furniture, by sharing body heat in overcrowded rooms, by losing fingers and livestock and weeks of memory to the cold, said they assumed she had died in the first week. It was a reasonable assumption. She was alone. The nearest town was 11 miles east, and the drift had sealed every road by mid-January. What no one could explain, even months later, was the frost pattern on the barn's floor. When they finally broke the door open in early April, the ground inside was different. Not frozen solid like the earth outside. Not even close. One section of the floor, near the back corner, was almost soft, and there was a smell, not of decay, not of rot, but of something else entirely. Warm earth, dry straw, faint traces of rendered fat, and smoke from a wick burned long ago. She had been in there, alive, for weeks. What she had built, what she had hidden, was something no one in that valley had thought to look for. It wasn't above the ground. It wasn't behind a wall. And it required no constant fire to keep a person from freezing. The secret was underneath, buried so well that even standing directly on top of it, you would never have known it was there. This is the story of how one woman engineered her own survival using nothing but observation, stone, soil, and a principle so old and so simple that the settlers around her had forgotten it entirely. And it starts with something she noticed about her animals, a detail so obvious, in hindsight, that it almost hurts to think about how many people missed it. If this kind of forgotten knowledge is what you're after, subscribe and drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? Let's hear it. There's a particular kind of confidence that comes from surviving a few winters in a row. By the autumn of 1886, the families settled along the eastern bench of the valley had reason to feel steady. They had endured 3 consecutive cold seasons without catastrophic loss. Their root cellars were stocked. Their woodpiles ran long and deep beside their cabins. Their children had been born here, had learned to walk on this soil, had grown up understanding the particular rhythm of a high-country winter, the way the cold arrived in waves, the way the first hard freeze always announced itself with a particular stillness in the air, a silence so complete it had its own texture. They were not reckless people. They were experienced people. And that distinction, it turns out, was exactly the problem. Experience teaches you to manage what you have already survived. It does not prepare you for what you haven't seen yet. The cabins in the valley were built according to the standards of the era, and those standards were deeply flawed in ways that no one, at the time, had the language to describe. Most structures followed a straightforward logic. For walls of notched timber, a central hearth or iron stove set near the middle of the floor, a single-layer roof of split shingles laid over rough-hewn rafters, and a foundation that amounted to little more than a ring of surface stones pressed into the topsoil. It looked solid. It felt solid. Until the temperature dropped below a certain threshold, it functioned well enough. But the physics of those cabins told a different story. A central fireplace in a single-room structure loses between 70% and 85% of its generated heat directly up the chimney flue, a number that holds true regardless of how much wood you burn. The walls, built of timber alone with no insulating fill between logs, conducted cold inward with the same efficiency that a cast-iron pan conducts heat outward. And the foundation, those surface stones set into the first few inches of soil, provided no thermal buffer whatsoever between the frozen ground and the living floor above it. On a night when outside temperatures fell to -10 degrees Fahrenheit, inside temperatures in these cabins could easily drop to 28 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 degrees Fahrenheit before the fire was stoked back to life at dawn. The settlers knew it was cold. They slept in layers, burned through their woodpiles at a rate of 3 to 4 cords per month in peak winter, and accepted numb fingers and frosted breath indoors as simply the cost of living where they had chosen to live. They did not think of it as a design problem. They thought of it as a weather problem. One woman in that valley thought differently. She had arrived 4 years earlier with her husband, a man who had spent 2 seasons working construction in the mining camps of the Northern Range and had learned, from the Scandinavian and Finnish laborers there, certain ideas about the relationship between stone, earth, and retained heat. He had begun applying some of those ideas to their homestead, sinking the foundation deeper than any neighbors, filling the gap between the outer and inner log walls with packed clay and dry grass. When he died of a sudden illness in the summer of 1885, leaving her with the cabin, the barn, 12 acres of marginal pasture, and an incomplete education in a kind of building philosophy that the rest of the valley had never heard of. She spent the following year finishing what he had started. And then she went further. The neighbors noticed she was doing something unusual around the barn. Digging mostly, moving stone, carrying timber in short sections that didn't seem long enough for any obvious purpose. When one of the men from the adjacent property offered to help, genuinely, without condescension, she thanked him and declined. She said she was just winterizing. He nodded and thought nothing more of it. That was the last autumn anyone paid close attention to what she was building. It began, as most useful observations do, with a problem she couldn't explain. In the deep cold of her first winter alone, January of 1886, before she had made any modifications to the barn, she noticed that the animals inside it were faring better than she had expected. Not just surviving, genuinely warm. On mornings when the air outside registered somewhere around minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and the inside of her cabin had dropped to a brittle 26 degrees Fahrenheit despite a fire banked all night, the horses in the barn were dry-coated and calm. The 2 milk cows stood loose-muscled and unhurried. The air inside the barn, when she pushed the door open and stepped in to do the morning feeding, carried a warmth that stopped her mid-step. Not fire-warm, not stove-warm, something else. A dense, settled kind of warmth, like the inside of a bread oven several hours after the last bake. Still, heavy, present. She stood there for a long moment with a pail in her hand, breathing it in. The barn had no stove, no fireplace, no heat source of any kind. It was a timber frame structure with wide gaps between the boards, less sealed against the elements than her cabin. By every logical measure, it should have been colder inside the barn than inside the house. And yet, she began paying attention in a more deliberate way. She started leaving a small thermometer, a simple alcohol instrument she had ordered from a catalog the previous spring, hung on a nail inside the barn, near the back wall. She checked it every morning at the same time she checked the one mounted outside the cabin door. Over the course of 6 weeks, a pattern emerged so consistent it almost seemed impossible. On the coldest nights, when outside temperatures plunged to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit or below, the interior of the barn held between 34 degrees Fahrenheit and 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Her cabin, with a fire actively burning, averaged between 44 degrees Fahrenheit and 52 degrees Fahrenheit in the main room, but required constant fuel and attention to stay there. The barn, with no fuel and no attention, simply held. She understood enough about animal physiology to know that large livestock generate considerable body heat. A mature dairy cow produces roughly 2,000 to 2,400 BTUs per hour at rest, comparable in output to a small electric space heater. With 2 cows and 2 horses sharing the space, the barn's animal population was generating something in the range of 7,000 to 9,000 BTUs per hour continuously, night and day, without consuming a single stick of wood. But that alone didn't explain what she was seeing. Heat generated without containment simply rises and escapes. Any barn, under those conditions, should have been leaking warmth constantly through every gap in the siding, every crack in the roof. And she could see that. Frost formed on the outer walls in intricate patterns that told her exactly how the heat was moving and where it was being lost. What the barn was doing was not storing heat efficiently. It was generating it continuously. And she realized, standing there in the cold with her thermometer in hand, that what she needed was not a better heat source. She already had one. What she needed was a container that could hold what the animals were already producing. She needed to go down, not up, not out, down. The logic arrived with a clarity she later described, according to a letter preserved in a local historical archive, as feeling less like an idea and more like a memory, as if she had always known it and had simply been waiting for the right question to unlock it. The Earth below the frost line, she understood, maintains a temperature of between 45 degrees Fahrenheit and 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round in that region, regardless of surface conditions, regardless of blizzard or wind chill or the length of the night. It does not warm quickly in summer. It does not cool quickly in winter. It is, by nature, a thermal battery, stable, patient, and already charged. If she could build a chamber below the floor of the barn, a space that sat within reach of that stable ground temperature, that was sealed tightly enough to trap the rising heat from the animals above, and that had enough stone mass in its walls to absorb and radiate that warmth slowly and evenly, she would have, in effect, a room that heated itself. The animals would be the furnace. The earth would be the insulation. The stone would be the radiator. She put down her pail and went to find her shovel. She began digging in late September, when the ground was still workable, but the season's urgency was already present in the angle of the afternoon light. The location she chose was deliberate in every detail. She did not dig in the center of the barn, where foot traffic and the weight of store hay above would have compromised the structure. She did not dig near the main doors, where cold air infiltration was heaviest and the thermal environment most unstable. She chose the northeast corner, the corner that received the least direct wind exposure due to the orientation of the barn relative to the prevailing westerly weather patterns, and the corner nearest to where the two cows spent the majority of their time standing. The corner placement was, by itself, a significant engineering choice. A corner captures and concentrates the convective air movement generated by warm bodies in an enclosed space. Heat rises, circulates, finds the walls, and descends again, but in a corner, that circulation has nowhere to dissipate laterally. It pools. She had watched this principle at work for months without naming it, observing that the northeast corner of the barn was consistently 2 to 3 degrees warmer than the center of the floor on still, cold mornings. She dug straight down, working in the early morning hours before the day's chores and again in the evenings after the animals were fed. The soil in the upper layer, the first 18 inches, was dense and root-threaded, slow to break and heavy to move. She hauled it out in a canvas sling and spread it across the far pasture in thin layers so that no obvious mound of displaced earth would appear near the barn to attract curiosity. Below 18 inches, the soil changed. It became drier, more uniform, and easier to read. She could feel the temperature shift with her hands as she worked deeper, the ground growing progressively less hostile, less reactive to the cold above. By the time she reached 36 inches of depth, the walls of her excavation held a dampness that did not freeze overnight. She noted this in the same letter mentioned earlier, writing simply, "Below 3 feet, the earth was on my side." The footprint of the chamber was modest by necessity, roughly 7 feet by 9 feet, enough for a sleeping platform, a small store shelf, a single stool, and comfortable movement without crowding. She did not want size. She wanted density. A smaller enclosed volume heats faster, loses heat more slowly, and requires less mass to stabilize its temperature. This was not a room for living in generously. It was a room engineered for a single purpose, keeping one person alive through a long cold. The walls she lined with flat sandstone gathered from the dry creek bed at the base of the property. Stones that ranged from 30 to 60 pounds each, laid in tight courses with a clay and grass mortar she mixed herself. She estimated, based on the dimensions of the chamber and the courses she laid, that the finished walls contained somewhere between 3,800 and 4,200 pounds of stone in total. That figure matters enormously, as we will examine in the next chapter. For now, it is enough to understand what that much stone looks like, a dense, gray, uneven surface that holds the cold of your palm for a moment before slowly, almost imperceptibly, giving it back. The ceiling was the most demanding part of the construction. She needed it low, no higher than 5 feet 4 inches, both to reduce the volume of air that would need to be heated and to force any rising warm air to remain in the occupied zone rather than stratifying above her head. She framed it with short sections of dry timber laid tightly together, then covered them with a double layer of sod, grass side down, pressed firm and flat. Above the sod, a thin layer of loose straw. Above the straw, the original barn floor, rebuilt over the chamber's location using boards she carefully renailed to match the surrounding planking. From above, standing in the barn, the floor looked untouched. The entrance required the most ingenuity of all. She built it inside the cow's primary stall, a low hatch, 24 inches wide and 30 inches tall, set into the floor at an angle so that the access tunnel descended at roughly 35 degrees before opening into the chamber below. The hatch cover was a heavy timber frame fitted with compacted straw bale on its upper face, disguised to look like a section of the stall floor used for additional bedding. To open it, you had to know exactly where to press and how to lift. Even standing directly on it, you would feel nothing unusual underfoot. She finished the chamber in the 3rd week of October, 11 days before the first hard frost of the season locked the ground solid. She carried down a sleeping pallet, a supply of tallow candles, a week's worth of dried provisions, a water vessel, and a small handwritten list of what she would need to replenish and when. Then she closed the hatch, walked back to her cabin, and waited to see what winter would bring. There is a principle in thermal physics so fundamental that it governs everything from the design of a kiln to the survival of a hibernating bear, and yet it was almost entirely absent from the building knowledge of most American frontier settlers in the 1880s. The principle is this: mass stores heat. And the more mass you have, the longer it stores it, and the more evenly it releases it back into the space around it. A cast iron stove is a crude demonstration of this. Everyone who has ever stood near 30 minutes after the fire went out has felt the principle at work. The iron still radiating warmth long after the combustion that produced it has ended. But cast iron is a relatively small mass, a few hundred pounds at most. It cools in hours. Stone is different. Sandstone, in particular, the flat-bedded, fine-grained variety she had quarried from the creek bed, has a volumetric heat capacity of roughly 0.3 BTUs per pound per degree Fahrenheit. That number sounds abstract until you apply it to the 4,000 pounds of stone she had mortared into those chamber walls. It means that the stone mass in that room could absorb, hold, and slowly release an amount of thermal energy equivalent to running a 1,200-watt electric space heater for approximately 6 to 8 hours, even after the heat source itself had gone quiet. But in her chamber, the heat source never went quiet. Above her ceiling, 1,200 to 1,400 pounds of living animal mass moved and breathed and generated heat continuously, 24 hours a day. The cows and horses above were not a backup system. They were the primary furnace. And unlike a wood stove, which demands fuel, attention, and produces a sharp thermal spike followed by a long, cold decline, the animals produced heat at a slow, constant, reliable rate. No spikes, no crashes, just a steady, patient output that the stone walls below absorbed shift by shift, hour by hour, like a battery being charged in slow motion. The geometry of the chamber amplified this effect in 2 distinct ways. First, the low ceiling. At 5 feet 4 inches, the ceiling forced the warm air rising from the stone-lined floor and walls to remain within the occupied zone, the band of air between the floor and roughly head height where a person actually lives and breathes. In a standard cabin with a 7 or 8-foot ceiling, warm air stratifies upward and accumulates in a zone above the occupant's head, where it does almost no practical good. The low ceiling of the chamber eliminated that waste entirely. The warm air had nowhere to go but to stay with her. Second, the corner placement. A room built into a corner of a larger structure benefits from what builders of a later era would come to call a thermal buffer zone, the mass of the surrounding structure acting as a windbreak and secondary insulator on 2 of the chamber's 4 sides. The barn walls on the north and east faces of the corner were not actively insulating the chamber, but they were slowing the rate at which outside cold could conduct inward through the soil on those sides. Every degree of temperature gradient reduced across those barriers was a degree of heat the stone walls did not have to replace. The entrance tunnel added another layer of passive engineering. Angled at 35 degrees and only 24 inches wide, it functioned as a cold trap, a design principle used in everything from traditional Inuit dwellings to modern passive house entryways. Cold air, being denser than warm air, tends to pool at the lowest point of any given space. By placing the tunnel entry at an angle below the chamber floor level, she ensured that any cold air infiltrating through the hatch would descend into the tunnel and stall there, rather than flowing freely into the main living space. Warm air, meanwhile, being lighter, would rise naturally away from the tunnel entrance and remain concentrated in the chamber above. None of this required a degree in engineering. It required observation, patience, and the willingness to think about heat not as something you produce, but as something you manage. The settlers around her were producing heat, burning through 4 cords of wood a month, waking at 3 a.m. to stoke dying fires, monitoring fuel reserves with a quiet, constant anxiety that was simply accepted as part of winter life. She was managing heat, capturing it, storing it, releasing it slowly, letting the physics of stone and soil and animal biology do the work that everyone else was doing by hand. The difference between those two approaches, in comfort, in fuel cost, in physical labor, in safety, was not subtle. By the time the real test arrived, it would be the difference between life and the alternative. The winter of 1886 to 1887 is remembered across the northern plains and mountain west under several names, none of them gentle. Some called it the Great Die-Up, a term that referred primarily to the catastrophic livestock losses suffered by the open-range cattle industry, which in some regions lost between 50% and 90% of its herds to a combination of extreme cold, ice-crusted snow that prevented grazing, and storms that arrived without pause across a period of nearly 3 months. Others called it simply the hard winter, in the flat, declarative way that people name things they do not want to describe in more detail. In the valley, it arrived in 2 movements. The first came in mid-November, an early hard freeze that dropped temperatures to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit within 48 hours and held them there for 11 days. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. Families tightened their routines. Extra bedding came down from storage. Wood piles were reassessed. Children were kept inside. The general attitude was one of heightened alertness rather than alarm. The second movement was something else entirely. It began on the 2nd day of January with a sky that turned the particular shade of yellow-gray that old-timers in the region associated with serious weather. The wind shifted to the northwest and began to build through the afternoon, not in gusts, but in a long, continuous escalation like pressure being applied to something that was going to give. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped from a daytime high of 8 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 6 hours. Oral accounts collected by a local historical society in the decades following described the sound of that night as unlike anything the valley had heard before, a sustained roar from the northwest that didn't rise and fall the way wind normally does, but simply pressed, unbroken, against every wall and roof and window frame for hours on end. The snow came horizontal. By morning, drifts had reached the eaves of the shorter cabins. The road east, the 11-mile track to the near settlement, was gone entirely, buried under 6 feet of consolidated drift in the low sections and scoured to bare frozen earth on the exposed ridgelines, making it impassable in either condition. The valley was sealed. Inside the cabins, families burned what they had. When firewood ran short, they burned furniture. When furniture ran short in the worst affected households, they burned fence rails, tool handles, the wooden frames of beds and chairs. The central logic of survival compressed itself, over the course of those first 2 weeks, into a single obsessive calculation. How much wood remained, how fast it was being consumed, and how many days stood between the present moment and a temperature that might allow travel to find more. The thermal performance of those cabins, already marginal in ordinary cold, became genuinely dangerous under sustained minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit conditions. Interior temperatures in the smaller structures dropped to between 18 degrees Fahrenheit and 24 degrees Fahrenheit during the nights, cold enough to freeze water left in a pail 10 feet from the stove. Cold enough that sleeping required multiple people sharing body heat beneath every available blanket and animal hide in the household. Cold enough that the distinction between inside and outside began to feel uncomfortably theoretical. 2 families in the valley abandoned their cabins entirely and consolidated into the largest structure on the neighboring property, a man named Elbert Crandall, whose cabin had been built with thicker walls and a larger stone hearth than most. Even there, by local accounts, the temperature on the coldest nights dropped to 29 degrees Fahrenheit in the far corners of the room, and the family burned through nearly half their remaining woodpile in the first 10 days of January alone. The barn at the northeast end of the property line, the one that had belonged to the woman everyone assumed was dead, stood silent through all of it. No smoke, no light visible through the board gaps after dark. No sound, nothing that suggested occupation or survival or any human presence at all. Just 4 gray walls holding still in the white. 61 inches below the surface of that barn's floor, in a chamber that no one in the valley knew existed, the temperature had not dropped below 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Not once. She had prepared for 6 weeks. The provisions she had carried into the chamber before the freeze included dried venison, hard cheese sealed in wax, dried beans and cornmeal in cloth sacks, a quantity of rendered lard in a clay crock, dried apples, and a small supply of salt, coffee, and tea. Water she had pre-stored in 2 large ceramic jugs, supplemented by a slow drip arrangement she had engineered from a clay pipe pressed into the soil of the north wall at a depth where the ground temperature kept it just above freezing, enough to maintain a trickle that refilled a collecting vessel over the course of each day. She did not expect to use all of it. The first week underground passed with a quality she would later describe, in a brief account shared with a neighbor in the spring, as almost peaceful. The chamber held steady at 46 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough for comfortable sleep in a wool blanket, cool enough that she could store her food supplies without concern for spoilage. The tallow candles she burned one at a time, extinguishing each before it was fully spent, and saving the stub for a later period when fresh ones might be gone. An average of 4 hours of candlelight per day. The rest of the time, darkness. She was not idle in the dark. She had brought needlework, an almanac, a small journal in which she recorded temperature readings, provisions consumed, and brief notes on the sounds she could hear from above. The shifting weight of the animals moving across the barn floor, the creak of the timber frame under wind load, the particular pitch of the storm when it was at its worst. Those journal entries, portions of which were later transcribed by a county historical recorder who examined the original document in the early 1900s, show a mind that was observing and recording rather than panicking. A person conducting an experiment and taking notes. January 9th. Wind unchanged from northwest. Chamber at 45 degrees by morning reading. Cows moving early. Something disturbed them before dawn, possibly the wind shifting. Temperature in tunnel entrance noticeably colder when I checked the hatch. Did not open. Beans and cornmeal for the day. Candle from 6 until 8. Slept well. The second week was harder, not because the chamber failed, but because the enforced stillness began to press on her. The space was 7 by 9 feet. There was nowhere to pace. She exercised by pressing her hands against the stone walls and pushing, by doing slow repetitions of standing and sitting, by rolling her shoulders and rotating her ankles in careful circles to maintain circulation. The stone walls, she noted, were never cold to the touch in the way that outdoor stone is cold, a detail that confirmed, in a tangible and reassuring way, that the thermal mass was working exactly as she had calculated it should. By the end of the second week, she estimated she had consumed roughly 1/3 of her provisions. She adjusted her daily rations downward by a modest amount, not from desperation, but from a simple discipline of a person who understood that the margin between enough and not enough was worth protecting. The animals above her continued to function as her furnace. She could hear them. The cows shifted and settled. The horses occasionally stamped a foot against the barn floor directly above her sleeping pallet, a sound she found oddly comforting, a reminder that life continued above her, that the system she had designed was holding, that the barn was doing what she had asked it to do. On the 19th day, she heard what she believed were voices outside the barn, the sound of men calling to each other across wind, the kind of short, directive shouts that people use when they are moving through difficult conditions and need to stay oriented to one another. She listened for a long time, pressing her ear to the underside of the hatch. The voices faded without the barn door opening. She waited another hour, then returned to her journal. January 19th. Voices outside. Could not determine direction or number. Did not announce myself. Chamber holding at 44 degrees. Adequate provisions for at least 3 additional weeks if current rationing continues. We'll wait. She waited. The storm's worst phase lasted, by most accounts collected from that winter, approximately 22 days of sustained extreme cold before a brief moderation allowed temperatures to rise into the single positive digits. A second hard period followed in mid-February, shorter but still severe. By the time conditions stabilized enough for travel in early March, the valley had been essentially isolated for nearly 8 weeks. She had been underground for 53 days. When she finally lifted the hatch on the morning of March 4th and climbed the angled tunnel into the barn, her animals were thinner than she would have liked. She had been feeding them from the barn's hay stores through a narrow access she had built for exactly this purpose, pulling the hatch just far enough to pass grain and water up without exposing the chamber. But they were alive. She stood in the barn for a long moment, letting her eyes adjust to the thin gray light coming through the board gaps. Then she pushed the barn door open and stepped outside for the first time in 53 days. The valley was white and silent. The trees at the far tree line were bent. One of the neighboring cabins, the one that had belonged to the youngest family on the eastern bench, had a section of roof that had partially collapsed under the snow load. She stood in the cold air and breathed it in. Then she went inside to start a proper fire, heat a full pot of coffee, and wait for someone to come and find her. The man who found her was Albert Crandall. He came on horseback on the morning of March 7th, 3 days after she had emerged from the chamber, moving slowly along the property line with the particular wariness of someone who expects to find something he does not want to find. He had a shovel tied to his saddle. He had brought it, he admitted later, because he expected to need it for a different purpose entirely. He saw the smoke first, a thin, steady column rising from the cabin chimney, pale gray against a sky that had finally, after weeks of pressure, opened itself to something approaching blue. He stopped his horse and stared at it for a long moment before urging the animal forward. She met him at the cabin door with 2 cups of coffee. The expression on his face, by her own account recorded in a letter she wrote to her sister the following month, was one she had never seen on a grown man before and never entirely forgot afterward. It was not simple relief, though relief was certainly part of it. It was something more complicated, a recalibration happening in real time, a man quietly revising a set of assumptions he had not realized he was carrying until the evidence in front of him made them impossible to maintain. He drank his coffee. He asked if she was well. She said she was. He asked how she had managed, the wood, the provisions, the cold. She told him she had been comfortable. He looked at her steadily for a moment, then looked past her at the barn, and then back at her and said nothing more on the subject for the rest of that first visit. Word moved through the valley the way news always moves in isolated communities, fast, selective, and shaped by the assumptions of the people carrying it. By the end of the first week of March, every family that had survived the winter knew that she was alive and apparently unharmed. The reaction was not uniform. Some were simply glad. The practical business of surviving a catastrophic winter leaves little room for extended skepticism, and several of the families who had burned their furniture and crowded into Crandall's cabin were too exhausted and too depleted to spend much energy on anything beyond relief that one more person had made it through. They asked her how she had done it. She answered plainly. Some of them nodded. Some of them did not quite follow. Others were more unsettled. Not hostile. The word is too strong, but genuinely disoriented. A woman, alone, with no surplus firewood visible, no consolidated household, No evident partnership or assistance of any kind, had not merely survived a winter that had nearly destroyed the entire valley's capacity to function. She had been, by her own description, comfortable. That word kept appearing in the accounts neighbors gave when they described the conversations of that spring. Not safe. Not alive. Comfortable. It landed differently than anything else she said. The most skeptical of them wanted to see the barn. She showed them. She walked them in through the main door, past the animals in their stalls, to the northeast corner. She pressed the concealed edge of the hatch cover with the heel of her boot and lifted it back on its hinges. She held a lantern over the opening so they could see the angled tunnel descending into the stone-lined space below. Several of the men crouched down and peered in. One of them climbed down into the chamber and stood in it for a while, holding his own lantern up to examine the walls. He pressed his palm flat against the sandstone. He held it there. He looked at the low ceiling, at the compacted sod above the timber frame, at the clay-mortar joints between the stone courses. He did not say anything for a long time. We climbed back out. He told the others that the walls were warm. Not warm the way a stove is warm. Not warm the way a fire-heated room is warm. Warm the way a living thing is warm. Steady, even, and present from the inside out. The stone had been absorbing heat for 5 months. Even now, weeks after the worst of the cold had passed, with no animal above it and no active heat source of any kind, the chamber held 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The soil surrounding it, the earth that had been its silent partner through the entire winter, was doing what it had always done, holding its temperature, patient and unchanged, regardless of what the surface world above it had endured. The man who had climbed down stood in the barn doorway and looked at the floor for a long time. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular, "She built a furnace that doesn't need wood." That sentence, or some version of it, passed through the valley over the following weeks with the same quiet persistence as a good idea usually does when it arrives at exactly the right moment. People repeated it not because it was technically precise, which it wasn't entirely, but because it captured something true about what they had seen, something that required a new category to understand. She had not merely survived. She had solved something, and the solution had been there underneath everyone's feet the entire time. There is a certain kind of knowledge that disappears not because it is disproven, but because it becomes inconvenient. In the decades that followed the hard winter of 1886 to 1887, the principles that had kept that underground chamber at 44 degrees Fahrenheit through 8 weeks of sustained extreme cold did not vanish from the earth. The soil still held its temperature below the frost line. Sandstone still stored and released heat at the same rate it always had. The thermal output of large livestock did not change. The physics did not change. What changed was the economic logic surrounding construction. The industrialization of the American building supply chain in the late 19th and early 20th centuries made certain materials dramatically cheaper and more accessible. Dimensional lumber, sheet metal stovepipes, manufactured cast iron stoves, and eventually standardized fiberglass insulation bats. These materials were faster to work with, easier to ship, and required less site-specific knowledge to apply. A builder in 1910 did not need to understand the thermal capacity of a local stone because he could order a catalog stove and a box of insulation from the same supplier and have a functional structure in a fraction of the time. The trade-off was invisible at the time. It only becomes visible when you run the numbers. A standard wood frame house built to typical mid-20th century specifications, 2x4 stud walls with fiberglass bat insulation, single-pane windows, a forced air furnace running on natural gas or fuel oil, has an effective thermal mass of near zero. The walls contain almost no material capable of absorbing and slowly releasing heat. What keeps the house warm is not stored energy, but continuous energy input. The furnace runs. The house is warm. The furnace stops. The house cools. Quickly. In practical terms, this means that a modern forced air house in a climate similar to that valley, sustained temperatures of minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, high wind, limited solar gain, requires the heating system to run almost continuously to maintain livable interior temperatures. Turn the system off for 12 hours in serious cold, and interior temperatures in a poorly insulated structure can drop 15 degrees Fahrenheit to 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Turn it off for 24 hours, and in the worst cases, pipe freezing temperatures become a genuine risk. The underground chamber, by contrast, lost less than 2 degrees Fahrenheit over a 12-hour period even during the worst nights of that January, and it had no mechanical system of any kind. No fuel cost, no moving parts, no failure modes beyond the structural integrity of the stone itself. This is not a romanticization of poverty or a dismissal of modern comfort. Forced air heating is faster, more controllable, and more convenient than anything available to a frontier homesteader. The point is not that the old way was better in all circumstances. The point is that something real was understood then that has been largely abandoned now, and its abandonment has a measurable cost. Contemporary research into passive building systems, earthship construction, earth-sheltered homes, rammed earth walls, thermal mass design, has arrived through rigorous engineering analysis at conclusions that would have been entirely recognizable to anyone who had stood in that chamber in January of 1887 and pressed their palm against a warm stone wall. The earth below the frost line is a stable thermal reservoir. High-density materials store and release heat more effectively than low-density ones. Small, well-sealed spaces with low ceilings retain heat with far less energy input than large, open ones. Passive heat sources, solar gain, occupant body heat, animal heat, can meaningfully reduce or eliminate active heating loads when a structure is designed to capture rather than waste them. A well-designed, earth-sheltered home in a cold climate today can reduce heating energy consumption by 50% to 70% compared to an equivalent above-grade structure. Some designs in mild enough climates require no active heating system at all. She built that home in 1886 with a shovel, a canvas sling, creek stone, and a clay mortar she mixed herself. The knowledge was never lost. It was simply set aside, filed under primitive and obsolete at exactly the moment when cheap fuel made setting it aside feel costless. Cheap fuel, of course, does not remain cheap forever. And winters, as the valley learned in the hard months of 1886 to 1887, do not negotiate. There's a version of this story that ends with a lesson, a neat, declarative conclusion about the wisdom of the past and the arrogance of the present, delivered with the confident finality of a textbook summary. This is not quite that version, because the truth of what she built is more interesting than a lesson. It is a question, and the question is not, why did we forget this? Though that is worth asking. The question is, what else is underneath us that we have not thought to look for? The chamber she built in the northeast corner of that barn endured, by local record, for at least 23 years after the winter that validated it. Neighbors who examined it in the years that followed described the stone walls as still solid, the mortar joints intact, the ceiling timbers dry and unrotted beneath their sod cover. The earth around it had done what earth does when left undisturbed. It had settled into a stable equilibrium, moisture-balanced and structurally sound, in a way that above-ground timber construction almost never achieves over the same time span. She used it again, not for emergency survival. The winters that followed, while cold, did not approach the severity of 1886 to 1887. But she stored food there through every subsequent summer and winter, maintaining temperatures between 42 degrees Fahrenheit and 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round without any active cooling or heating. It was, in effect, a root cellar with thermal properties superior to almost any above-ground alternative. The cream from her cows kept longer. The root vegetables held firmer. The dried goods stayed dry. She also, in the years that followed, quietly helped 2 other families in the valley build similar chambers beneath their own outbuildings. She did not charge for the knowledge or make ceremony of passing it on. She simply showed up when asked, walked the site, identified the corner, and helped dig. The instruction she gave was practical and specific. Go down at least 36 inches before you start laying stone. Keep the ceiling below 5.5 feet. Angle the entrance down before it opens into the main space. And use the heaviest stone you can find locally. Do not use brick if you can avoid it. Brick is too porous, too quick to release what it absorbs. Those chambers, if they still exist beneath properties in that region, are invisible, covered by barn floors long since rebuilt, unmarked by any sign or record beyond the faint oral tradition that eventually found its way into the notes of a county historian who collected homestead accounts in the 1920s. They're full of soil now, most likely, or collapsed, or simply forgotten the way most practical knowledge gets forgotten, not in a single moment of loss, but in a long, quiet succession of seasons during which no one thought to maintain what no one remembered was there. But the principle they embodied is not forgotten. It cannot be, because it is not a human invention. It is a physical fact. The earth below the frost line holds a constant temperature. Stone absorbs and releases heat slowly and evenly. A sealed space with high thermal mass and a passive heat source will maintain a survivable temperature through conditions that would defeat any system dependent on continuous active fuel consumption. These facts were true before she built that chamber. They were true while she spent 53 days inside it. They are true right now, underneath every barn and outbuilding and garden bed in every cold climate region on the continent. The soil does not forget what it knows. It simply waits for someone to ask the right question. She asked it with a shovel. She got her answer in January, when the temperature outside her hidden door fell to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, and the stone wall beside her sleeping pallet held 44 degrees Fahrenheit, steady and unhurried, like a thing that has never been in any doubt. There is a particular kind of intelligence that does not announce itself, that does not seek credit or audience or approval, that simply builds, observes, adjusts, and endures. The barn is gone now, burned in a brush fire sometime in the early 1930s, according to a brief notation in a county land record. The chamber beneath it, if it survived the fire, is under open pasture today, unmarked, unremarkable from the surface. But the frost line in that region still sits at roughly 36 inches, exactly where it was in 1886. And the earth below it is still 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Give or take a degree on the coldest night of the year. It always will be. All you have to do is dig. This script is a historical and educational reconstruction based on vernacular engineering principles and frontier-era oral and archival accounts. Names, specific dates, and certain details have been reconstructed for narrative clarity. This content is intended for educational and historical entertainment purposes only and does not substitute for professional engineering, construction, or safety guidance. Always consult licensed professionals before undertaking any structural or excavation project.